For all of you who are new, this is a monthly series we do on China, and we advertise them. So just keep your eyes open. We have only 2 more this year. So David used to run the World Bank operation in China, was also the U.S. Treasury attaché in China in the Obama administration, is now a senior China economist at the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank in Washington, and most importantly is among the wisest, most astute, and most thoughtful observers of the Chinese economy around, which is what he's going to talk to us about. It's a good time to do that because all is not so well with the Chinese economy these days. There was a time, I remember, 10 years ago, you'd pick up a newspaper and all you could read about was China going from strength to strength to strength. It was growing rapidly. It was the workshop to the world. That's not so much the case anymore, and that's not necessarily new. I mean, as far back as I think the mid-2000s, the signs of some of this were readily apparent. In fact, the Prime Minister of China at the time, Wen Jiabao, became famous for saying that the Chinese economy was unbalanced, unstable, uncoordinated, and unsustainable, and that was around 2007. So here we are 10 years later with some of the problems, policy priority, but other things not necessarily being reformed or happening quite so fast. And reform, I would argue, more of a political problem than an intellectual one. Lots of people in China know what to do, but these things are tough to do. But notwithstanding all those issues and challenges, China's also ramping up its global economic profile apace at the same time in all kinds of interesting and important ways. It's the world's second largest economy, largest trader, largest manufacturer now by gross value add, and major capital exporter, and potentially the most significant capital exporter, including to large swaths of the globe where they are capital poor. And so China's role has become interesting and outsized. And of course, they play a big role in global economic institutions as well. So with that as background, we asked David to come out finally and talk to us a little bit about what China means for the world and for the global economy, global economic institutions, and so on. But to anchor that in your always interesting assessments of what's happening in China itself and on the Chinese economy as well. So we're very casual. We'll have you come up here and talk for a little bit, do your own Q&A. And we're thrilled we finally got you here, and especially me, because I've been trying so hard. So please join me. Welcome David Dollar to Chicago.
All right. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Thank you very much, Evan. Really a great pleasure to be here at the Paulson Center and at the University of Chicago. I'll try to be disciplined and talk for no more than half an hour, maybe a little bit less than that, and then we can have a question and answer. Evan asked me to talk about China's changing role in the global economy, and so I've interpreted that to cover 3 topics. First, I'll talk a little bit about the transformation that's going on in China's economy and how that makes China's interaction with the rest of the world different from what it used to be. Second, I want to talk about China's role in global economic institutions like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, etc. And then third, I feel compelled to say a little bit about U.S. China economic relations. We just had this summit meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi, but I'm probably going to keep that brief, especially if I'm running into time constraints. So let me start with the first point, that there's this serious transformation going on in China's economy that influences how China interacts with the rest of the world. And I think we used to think of China's economy very much export-driven, but it's also the case that it always had a high investment rate. So it's an economy driven by exports and investment. It got very good results from that. But I think around the time of the global financial crisis, China really has had to change its economic strategy. When the global financial crisis hit, China's exports dropped by about 1/3 very quickly. An estimated 20 million workers lost their jobs. This was really a big shock for China. And it responded with a pretty aggressive stimulus program, which in many ways was a good idea. But they aimed the stimulus almost completely at investment. And the short version of this story is that they really overdid it. Okay? They took an already high investment rate and they brought it up to 47 or 48% of GDP. I won't put too many numbers into this kind of talk, but I like to point out that at that investment rate, you double your capital stock in 6 years. So I lived in China for 9 years, from 2004 to 2013. By the time I left, probably 2/3 of all the built capital stock in the country had been put in place during the short time that I lived there. And while that intense investment program was occurring, that was creating a certain type of demand for the rest of the world. So China drove up the price of energy and metals. And frankly, I travel a lot in the developing world. China's kind of the hero. I was just in Uganda recently, in a lot of Latin America, in a lot of Asia. China was Mongolia. China was the hero for driving up the prices of energy and metals, also food, importing large volumes from these countries. I do think that period is now really coming to an end. Problem with that pattern was that China, in building up the capital stock so quickly, they really overdid it. The way an economist would think about it is there's just not enough demand to productively use all that capital stock that they put in place. And a more intuitive point would just be to say they created excess capacity throughout the economy. You see it particularly in real estate, third and fourth tier cities, lots of empty buildings, in fact, whole empty cities. You see it in manufacturing, where at certain moments in the last few years, some key sectors have been operating at about 50% of capacity, and that I would argue they've overbuilt infrastructure as well. Evan knows one of my favorite anecdotes, told to me by a Chinese economist friend, was that he was traveling in Inner Mongolia, and the local government officials were very proud about a new bridge, and it was not a bridge to nowhere, but it was a bridge over nothing. And so my economist friend pointed out that, okay, it's a lovely new bridge, but it's not over anything. And the local official said, don't worry, the 5-year plan includes a river. So first we build a bridge, then we build a river. So I think it's debatable, how good some of these recent investments are going to be. And what happens in this situation is quite naturally the profitability of a lot of corporate activities declines. This is most obvious in industry. And then from an economist point of view, productivity growth, what we call total factor productivity growth, has slowed very dramatically in China. And in that environment, it's natural for the more profit-driven investment to slow down. This is what we've seen in the last couple years. Last year, private investment in China grew at 3%. Which is startlingly low. I don't know the exact figure for the U.S., but we may very well have had faster investment growth than China, which is still at a development stage. Now, at the same time, there are some good things happening in China as part of this transformation. Consumption has been growing very consistently, okay? And that may seem slightly surprising, but I think there's a virtuous circle going on. China's labor market is tightened up. The demographics are such that the labor force has basically peaked in size and is starting to decline. So wages have been rising, household incomes rising. That fuels the consumption, and consumption is mostly services, and those industries are more labor intensive. So you've got a nice circle going where most of the job creation is in services. The labor market so far has remained tight. Consumption is held up. And consumption has mostly been driving GDP growth in the last couple years. So a simple way to think about the Chinese economy in the last couple years is that consumption has been providing about 4.5 percentage points of GDP growth. And if the Chinese authorities could just be happy with that, or maybe they aspire to a little bit more, 5 or 5.5, then this transformation could go on relatively smoothly. Okay? I mean, they've basically overinvested, so investment needs to slow down, and that's going to have to continue for a while. But they're very reluctant to accept a number like 4.5 or 5.5. They keep pushing for this arbitrary target of 6.5. And in order to do that, they're issuing a lot of credit, trying to keep investment up, even though natural economic forces are slowing investment down. And you see this clearly in the division between private and public investment. As I said, private investment last year grew very slowly, but they're pushing a lot of credit to state enterprises and to what we call local government investment vehicles that continue that local government infrastructure investment. So their investment rate growth was enough to bring the economy growth up to their target of 6.5, a little bit higher, right? But in this process, they're issuing a lot of credit to GDP is rising, or actually the debt to GDP is rising, And probably most alarming is that in the corporate sector, this leverage, this ratio of debt to value added is going up very dramatically. And there are kind of standard warning bells among international economists, and China's definitely reached the kind of debt to GDP that's setting off warning bells. Now, personally, I don't think China's going to have a classic financial crisis. They have a lot of tools. They still have a relatively closed capital account. It's a state-owned banking system that's lending money to state-owned enterprises. So they can find ways of preventing a financial crisis. But all of those ways come with the cost. For example, they have a fund that's taking profits from successful state enterprises, subsidizing failed state enterprises. So that's just a misallocation of capital that's going to make it hard for you to grow quickly. They're telling banks to keep lending to companies that are basically zombies. That prevents a financial crisis in the short run, but that's another kind of inefficiency, pouring bad money after good. But the main thing I wanted to emphasize is this change in China, what's the impact on the rest of the world? So as I said, I think China's demand for metals and energy, I think this is going to be muted for the foreseeable future. So I wouldn't, it's impossible really to predict commodity prices, but I wouldn't expect those commodity prices to come back to the kind of levels that we saw during China's big investment boom. Food is slightly different. We can get into specific things in the Q&A, but metals and energy, it's going to be hard for Latin America and Africa to see the kind of benefits they were seeing from China's growth during the big investment boom. On the other hand, I think an important new phenomenon in the world is that China is becoming the biggest supplier of capital to the rest of the world. Just to get technical for a moment, okay, the net outflow of capital is equal to the current account if we ignore reserve accumulation, so that broadest measure of trade, and that's equal to the difference between savings and investment. China has a very high savings rate. It's starting to come down. It'll probably come down as a result of those demographics. But we're seeing a more rapid decrease in China's investment rate, because of the factors I was talking about, kind of a return toward a more normal level of 35% or so would be normal for a rapidly growing developing country. So China's becoming a big exporter of capital, and you see this in some of their large initiatives like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the One Belt, One Road program. But I would say don't get too distracted by those big political programs. The main phenomenon here is economic. Last year, $725 billion of capital net left China. And the biggest destination is actually the United States. And two other big destinations are Australia and the United Kingdom. Okay? None of us is involved in One Belt, One Road, or none of us is borrowing from AIIB. So I think that Chinese capital outflow is large enough to do a lot of different things. And one of the main things it's doing is going to Europe and North America, which is where a lot of capital flows go in general. But then having said that, a higher proportion of Chinese capital goes to the developing world than would be true for, say, for Western investment. So there is a grain of truth to China's providing a lot of financing in Africa, in Latin America, in developing Asia, and it's doing it through those initiatives I mentioned, and it's funding infrastructure, and it's also funding direct investment. So I think that's likely to continue, and my perception traveling in the developing world is this is generating a lot of soft power for China. Other developing countries appreciate that China is financing infrastructure, and in some cases, Chinese construction companies are coming in and building this infrastructure. So that's really my first point, and it was what I wanted to spend the main amount of time on, is we're seeing changes in the Chinese economy that result in it emerging as the largest supplier of capital globally, and that's taking the form of a lot of different initiatives. Now, the second topic I wanted to take up was China's role in global economic institutions. Thinking of World Trade Organization, World Bank, other development banks, IMF. And you might think that China is challenging this existing order, and you'll see that narrative in some accounts. that China is rising up and challenging the existing order. I'm going to argue that China is largely a status quo power, that I see China essentially supporting the existing international economic architecture, which is to some extent a good thing. But actually, the current state of the architecture is not necessarily perfect. And in particular, there are things the United States would like to see in terms of changes. And in many ways, China is resisting changes in this international architecture. So I want to try to avoid making a value judgment, but my perception is China is supporting the existing status quo. They like it quite a lot, and they're actually resisting reform or change in that. So let me get into a little bit more detail. And I think probably trade may very well be the most important of these different categories. So China is the largest exporting nation in the world. It has comparative advantage in manufacturers. It's the largest manufacturing producer and exporter. And in general, China likes the World Trade Organization. It's a global agreement that primarily adjudicates trade in manufactures. So it's mostly an agreement about reducing tariffs and preventing high tariffs in manufacturing. There are a lot of special disciplines for agriculture, and I would argue that the service sectors are not well covered by the WTO at all. So China actually likes this particular institution. It keeps tariffs low. It enables China to sell products. When there are disputes, we resolve them within the WTO. China's lost a few cases, and it's largely followed the orders that came out of the WTO adjudication process. I think it's interesting that as our current Trump administration considers withdrawing from the world, and it's not clear at all how serious that is, but rhetorically, it seems like the U.S. is withdrawing from the world. Xi Jinping was quick to step in at Davos and elsewhere and become the champion of free trade. This is a little bit disingenuous because China has a lot of restrictions on imports into China. Okay? China, its investment had a lot of import content, as I mentioned. I think I forgot to mention that China's consumption has very little import content. Right? So as China shifts more toward a focus on consumption, a real issue is it doesn't really consume much in the way of imports. You'll see lots of American brand cars in China, but all the value added pretty much is from China, and the same for a lot of electronic products and for Starbucks, Kentucky Fried Chicken, lots of brands. Almost all the value added is domestic. There's very little imported value added going into China's consumption. So China likes the WTO. The U.S. has been pushing the frontier of trade agreements. We want to have a trade agreement in services, TISA. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was opening up new areas of investment agreement, environmental and labor standards, intellectual property protection. So you could see TPP as the U.S. pushing into new areas for this important trade agreement. We've been negotiating bilateral investment treaties with different countries because more and more global trade is in services, and it's really hard to trade services without investment. Right? It's hard for the U.S. financial services industry to sell services to China if it cannot invest in China, which has largely been the situation up till now. So the U.S. has been pushing, and largely China pushes back. China was not one of the TPP negotiators. Hasn't been involved in TISA, but it's been interested. It's been very hard to try to negotiate a bilateral investment treaty with China. China is pursuing a regional agreement with ASEAN and other partners, but it's very much in the traditional mode of tariff cutting and trying to assure freedom of manufacturing trade. In the multilateral development banks, China's probably gotten the most attention as something of a maverick by starting the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a new multilateral development bank. That's definitely been seen as a challenge to the existing order in some commentary. I don't see it as a challenge to the existing order. We already have a system where there are various multilateral banks, so we accept that competition among multilateral banks is a healthy thing. In a lot of ways, China's bank goes back to the original mandate of the World Bank. So, why did China start its own bank? it feels that it doesn't have its fair share of voting power in the World Bank and the IMF, and the U.S. has been slow to recognize that. And what would China do if it had more control in, say, the World Bank? Well, what I hear them saying is they would like a focus on growth and infrastructure. They would like the World Bank to get back to its original mandate. Their charter for their AIB is very similar to the original World Bank charter. It was actually drafted by a retired World Bank lawyer, but of course the content came from all the different parties. And one of the key things the Chinese emphasize is they want their bank not to get involved in politics. They want it to make decisions based on economic criteria, not politics or human rights or democracy. Curiously, that is in the original charter of the World Bank. The idea was to lend based on economic criteria, not pay attention to those other factors. And people often forget that two of the biggest clients of the World Bank have been China and Vietnam. So I see China wishing the banks would get back to their original business of lending for infrastructure, and they feel that the World Bank has broadened the mandate, broadened its agenda so far that it's lost its focus and it's gotten confusing. It's also the case that, ironically, the U.S. has been something of a constraint to increasing the size of the World Bank. So I was sat through 5 different S&ED discussions between China and the United States. So I remember one where the Chinese were saying, why don't the two of us propose that we double the size of the World Bank? And the U.S. side, this is after Secretary Paulson, the U.S. side response was, that's impossible. We couldn't possibly get Congress to double the capital, okay? And the Chinese said, so we're proposing to increase the size of your bank, the one where you're the biggest shareholder and you have a monopoly, and you don't want to do it, basically. And that's the kind of political reality. So the Chinese went off and started their own bank with lots of 60-plus countries now, and they recently announced that they're going beyond Asia. They're going to lend to the whole world. So they are clearly a competitor with the World Bank. So I said, I view this as a positive thing. I don't view this as a challenge to the existing system to have a new development bank. And then just briefly on the IMF, the Chinese, in my perception, they're becoming very powerful within the IMF and becoming a very powerful financer of the world, of the IMF. And they like the IMF's lender of last resort role. And as China becomes the biggest net creditor in the world, of course, it makes sense that they would like an institution that's aimed at global financial stability and that helps countries with balance of payments problems. On the other hand, as the IMF at times has been pushed to expand its mandate, for example, into more surveillance of exchange rates, China has resisted that. China resisted the idea that the IMF should be the stamp of good approval on your exchange rate policies and your capital controls. So I see China defending the status quo of international institutions in an interesting way, in some cases opposing trends toward reform, some of which I would argue are necessary reforms. So as I said, I'm trying to avoid a value judgment. The fact that China's status quo power, we can discuss, is it a good thing or a bad thing, but I think it's definitely a status quo power. It's not challenging the global economic system. How am I doing for time, by the way?
You're good.
Okay. So third topic, a little bit of a tack on, but I want to talk a little bit about U.S. China relations, because we just had this important summit meeting in Florida. And my basic reaction to reading a lot of the lead up and the follow up to that is that the United States is playing small ball while China is swinging for the fences, okay? And what I mean by that is China's got these big initiatives, AIB, One Belt, One Road. It's generating a lot of soft power. It's investing huge amounts of money. In our relations with China, we seem focused very much on a lot of small issues. Won't China open up the beef market? It would be nice if American investment banks could have 100% investments in China instead of having to work through joint ventures. The U.S. has a lot of legitimate economic issues with China. So it is a problem that China has so many closed markets, okay? I definitely think that is a problem. But as I say, I think there are bigger things happening in the world, and it can be a mistake for the United States to get really focused on those negotiating those relatively small things. So let me mention a couple of specific issues. Currency has been an issue between China and the U.S., and very much when Secretary Paulson started the SED, it was an important issue. China's currency was seriously undervalued. Pretty much all economists agree on that. I worked in Treasury after that period. By the time China had appreciated very significantly against the dollar, I said, why don't we just declare victory, right? But there seemed to be great reluctance to just declaring victory on this one. China's currency is not undervalued according to the IMF, according to most international economists. And in particular, they have not been intervening to keep it low. They've been intervening very aggressively to keep it high because they've got this big capital outflow coming out of their country, and they're trying to manage it in a relatively stable way, which I think is responsible. So I think we should, for the moment, put aside the currency issue because China's being a good citizen. It's worth emphasizing they should continue to be a good citizen, but that's not really an area of contention. There are lots of legitimate market access issues. You know, we have not been able to sell beef in China. They have 25% import tariff on cars. I'm sure you've seen a lot of this in the recent press coverage of the summit. To me, the most serious issue is they restrict investment in the service sectors. And as I said, it's very hard for us to sell services if we can't invest. So financial services, media, telecom, logistics, healthcare. You know, we have a very elaborately differentiated industry in the U.S. for assisted living, for example. Those firms would love to get into China. There's going to be this tremendous aging of the population. So it is frustrating that China won't open up more of these markets. It's a legitimate concern. I'm worried about it. You know, if you ask me, do I think it would make a big difference on the U.S. economy if China just did all these things we wanted? My answer would be that's not going to have a big effect on the U.S. economy. You know, we have a lot of issues in the U.S., you know, that I think are serious. Infrastructure, immigration. You know, I could give you a long list of things the U.S. needs to do to strengthen the economy, but that's not the subject of this talk. But I think if we're not doing those things to strengthen the U.S. economy, you know, then China, following our wishes and opening up a lot of these markets, it's not going to have a big effect. It's actually good for China, so we should continue to encourage China to open up, but we shouldn't have expectations that it'll have a big effect on the U.S. economy, and we certainly shouldn't expect that it's going to bring back millions of manufacturing jobs. So let me just wrap up. So really three main points. I think China's been an important global player for a long time, but for a lot of that time, it was really its demand for energy and metals and its effect on other developing countries through that route. That was really the key thing going on, and I think that's changed permanently. You know, China, of course, will continue to demand energy and metals, but it's not going to have the same effect on prices and volumes that it had in the past. On the other hand, China's emerging as the biggest investor in the world, you know, and that's potentially quite important. And it seems very welcome by a lot of developing countries around the world. And it seems pretty welcome here in the U.S., where we are the biggest destination of Chinese investment. In terms of global economic institutions, I largely see China as a status quo power that's supportive of these institutions. It has some specific desires. They often take the form of maintaining the status quo, which I view as slightly ironic. And the status quo is not necessarily ideal. Institutions need to evolve as the world changes. So I'm not saying there isn't some problem or clash there, but I see it as the problem or clash is that China's defending the current institutions. It's not setting up an alternative set of institutions. Certainly hasn't shown any inclination in that direction so far. And then in the U.S. China economic relations, I'm pleased that some of the very heated rhetoric from the campaign has been dialed down. So I don't expect that we're going to have any trade war between China and the U.S. But I do think the U.S., it has unrealistic expectations of what China might do in terms of market opening in a 1 to 2 year time frame. Our political time frame is extraordinarily short, and probably not much will happen in the next 1 to 2 years. And if we were not making complementary reforms in the background, it also wouldn't really make very much difference. Very convenient to blame China for all kinds of problems of the United States, but I think it's a poor diagnosis and it's not going to lead to good results. So why don't I stop there, and the Secretary has the first question.
So, David, thank you, and it's very good. So the question I have for you is, so I agree with you that we're playing small ball, and so what would you say if we wanted to play long ball are the things we should be doing vis-a-vis China? I can think of all kinds of things we should be doing with our own economy. We should have been pursuing the TPP. There are all sorts of things we should be doing unilaterally. But in terms of our economic relationship with China, what would be your definition of long ball rather than small ball?
So that's an incredibly difficult question, because I think you've grappled with this, and Secretary Geithner and others, so there can't possibly be an easy answer to this. I've mostly focused on trying to argue against certain things that have been discussed in the campaign, like naming China currency manipulator, which would not be accurate. 45% tariff, that's going to hurt our firms, and our exports will decline if we do that. So I've mostly focused on those sort of negative things. So if you kind of serious answer, long ball, I think it's great. We actually have 350,000+ Chinese students in the United States now, so I think that's great. I think we should, have a deliberate policy, and of course from many other countries too. I think we should have a deliberate policy of encouraging that, and there's some danger that it's going backwards. And I think we should be giving green cards to everybody who gets an BA or higher in the United States. So, and that relates to China, because 350,000 of those are Chinese students, and that number is growing. So if you get more Chinese, moving into the U.S. labor force, I view that as a positive link between the two economies. I've also written that I would consider limiting the purchases by Chinese state enterprises of firms in the United States, because they're operating behind protected walls and then coming into our economy and often buying their competitors. And so I don't have the same presumption that a Chinese state enterprise buying assets in the U.S. is going to generate benefits for our economy. But I'd have trouble arguing that wasn't small ball, right? So do you have do you want to weigh in on this?
No, because I'd looked at arguing, I think there's been a lot of reform, not as much as I would like in China, but not much opening up. And so I would be pushing to open up hard, thinking that's good for China and good for us. But I agree with you, that's not, our problems are of our own making, and the only things I can come up with for playing long ball are things we need to do to keep the United States strong and competitive and being a leader on the global stage. But I just, I wasn't trying to be cute. I just was wondering whether you had some ideas I hadn't heard before that we could be doing globally with China.
It is ironic that the United States is kind of pulling back from support to the World Bank and the other multilateral banks where we are shareholders, when there's tremendous demand in the world. So, we could now come back to China and say, you proposed years ago that we work together to double these institutions. Are you still willing to do that now that you've started your own AIB? This gentleman here.
Thank you for your talk. And I have a question about U.S. China relations. And some scholars argue that the way Americans created its hegemonic leadership in Asia was to create a dependency system, a dependent economic system, and making Asian states dependent on American trade and markets and resources. And if we look at the trade volume right now, China became the #1 trade partners to Korea and Japan, and including other Southeast Asian countries. And then, according to this framework, and then people can say that American influence could decline in Asia. But if we look at the other aspect of China's economic development and modernization, and there's a strongly rising nationalism, because China has strong motivations to reintegrate the nation, and then also mobilizes the citizens to create more integrated and efficient and productive economic system. And the manifestations of this kind of this nationalism is a territorial conflicts. And then one can, and then many people say, like, the Asian states has a strong motivations to bring the United States to balance China. And then about these two ambivalent aspects, and I'm wondering how you think about, I'm wondering like if the US influence will decline in the long term in Asia. If so, why? And if not, why not?
Okay, so there were a lot of interesting thoughts there. It seemed to me the kind of question at the end. So I do not think that the United States has to be a declining power. I think the United States can aspire to roughly keep its share of global GDP, or see only a small diminution in our share of global GDP. And a lot of it, depends on the United States. So, during the Obama administration, we had so-called pivot toward Asia. I think there was a lot of confusion about that, but it definitely had a security dimension, and to me, it had a key economic dimension, which was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I think it's unfortunate the U.S. has pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think we have a lot of, if you look around the Asian landscape, we have a lot of economic partners who are also security partners. Singapore, Australia, South Korea, Japan, those are the obvious ones. Taiwan, we have kind of a complicated security relationship. But, I think a lot of our Asian partners are looking for economic integration and security umbrella. Now, China's different. We have a really enormous economic relationship with China, right? But clearly we have a somewhat contentious security relationship. In many ways, it's an amazing achievement that we have so much trade between the United States and China, and now so much investment between two countries that are, that are not allies. And so I view that as largely a positive thing. And I think if the U.S. does the kind of things that we've been discussing, which are mostly not directly China related, we can maintain both the security and the economic role in Asia. But it is a challenge. One point I probably should emphasize, China doesn't have to do that well to be the biggest economy in the world. The Chinese are determined to try to keep growth up at 6.5. I think that's a mistake. If they would just accept that for a time at least, growth might be more like 5, and then it'll eventually slow down beyond that even further in the future, that would be a certain maturity on their part, recognizing that. And they're still going to be the biggest economy in the world. I don't think there's any set of U.S. policies that would get us to grow faster than 3, and that would be a tremendous aspiration on our part. It would take really hard work to get us to grow at 3 on a consistent basis. And, China will probably emerge as the biggest economy in the world, so we have to get along with them. We have to have, try to have a lot of trade and investment relations and manage the security tensions. Chang Tai-Hsia.
You made the point several times that China is a growing net investor in the world. I'm trying to reconcile that statement with the fact that China's current account surplus has fallen dramatically. So in 2008, it was like 9% of GDP. Now it's down to 2 to 3% of GDP. So is it possible that one way to reconcile that the current account surplus is masking an increase in gross flows? That what's happening is that China is investing a lot more in the rest of the world, and then the rest of the world is investing a lot more in China. So then the current account surplus isn't really giving you the full picture of the story. And then if that's the case, then maybe is what's going on is that there are different actors that in China that are doing the investing, and there are different actors in the rest of the world that are doing the investing. So the second question, in terms of your first comment, is that so you mentioned the fact that the investment rate has gone up from roughly 40% to 48 to 49%. Most of it is driven by the creation of these off-balance sheet financing companies of local governments. Do you have a sense of what these local financing vehicles are doing, whether they've changed? In 2008 and 2009, mostly they were basically carrying out the fiscal stimulus. at least the couple that I know, when you look at them now, that's only a very small part of what they're doing. And so I will wonder whether you have some more information about that. At least the couple that I know is that they seem to be operating almost like private equity funds now. So they're investing in companies. They're creating financial financial institutions. So I'm wondering whether you have some more information about how that 48% of investment in 2009 is not the same thing as 40% of investment in 2017, and what that implies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So Chang Thai's written really interesting things about this whole stimulus program and what local governments are doing. So I'm sure you know more about it than I do. So my response to I'll come back to the first question, but my response to the second question is, as you know, there's a lot of opacity, so it's very hard to know what these local government investment vehicles are doing now. I would say there can't be any good answer to the question, what are they doing? My instinct is they're still doing a lot of core infrastructure, but I think they've overbuilt the infrastructure. So I think a lot of those marginal projects now are really, not all that useful for China. But you're raising the possibility that as they've run out of infrastructure projects, they've kind of positioned themselves as, you call it almost like private equity. We know all along those vehicles have been doing some things that were outside of infrastructure. They've been financing universities and things like that, but then lots of real estate commercial projects. If more and more of that local government investment is in those commercial activities, that doesn't make me happy, because I don't have any confidence the local government can do that well, and I think that that's just going to lead to all kinds of problems, because things like real estate have been pretty much private sector driven in China. So if you start getting local governments taking over a lot of that, then you really are crowding out. Many of economists have talked that the stimulus crowded out the private sector kind of implicitly, by having so much concentration on public infrastructure. But it may be that, as you're suggesting, they're actually crowding them out much more directly, taking over commercial activities. Right? That's the best answer I can give. The first question, thank you, very good question. So you're right that if you go back, so I think when I first moved to China, the current account surplus very quickly hit 10% of GDP, okay? By the time I left, by the way, it was down below 3. So I'm still waiting for my bonus from the U.S. Department of Treasury, plus the exchange rate appreciated an enormous amount. But that's just kidding. But remember, Chang Thai, the economy was much smaller, right? So if you look at the if you look at the Chinese surplus either as a share of world GDP or just in constant US dollars, right? It never went down in any big way. I think it went down a little, but now it's rising again. And I would say back in that earlier period, as you know, the counterpart to the current account was they were buying a lot of treasury bonds and bills, and that's a certain type of capital outflow, but I view that as a very specific type that I don't think had a big effect on the world economy. And so now, similar or larger amounts of dollars or shares of world GDP are now going out and financing different types of real activity. And I think my point is only going to look smart a few years from now if we're on an upward trend. I mean, I'm worried that investment is dropping and the savings rate is going to continue. And so I don't think it'll go back to 8, 9, 10% of China's GDP. I don't think the world could take that, but it could head north from where it is. And I stand by the general point that I think, leaving aside the treasury bond market, they've become a much bigger financer. Oh, and then you question whether or not maybe there was a large inflow into China.
Gross.
Yeah, but the inflows into China have diminished, actually.
Okay, so you think that it's mostly due to more shift in the composition of the asset base, so a shift away from treasuries towards towards other parts of investment.
Right. Is this gentleman here?
There's a mantra that the rise of populists came from the failure of having some mechanism to compensate the losers from global trade and finance. And but you mentioned that there's even more of a trend toward the even among the state-owned enterprises for the winners to pay the losers. And so I wonder whether there's some common issue that there are a lot of critics of capitalism in Europe and the United States who say that there has to be some move away from capitalism to a kind of socialism. But I wonder if there's really an entirely different way of viewing it, that what's really required is some greater investment in human capital, both in the United States and in China, and including the idea of having a banking system that will lend to new entrepreneurs. There's also been a lot of criticism of the American banking, the regulatory response to the financial crisis, that it's made banks less likely to finance new entrepreneurs. So I'm wondering whether there's a kind of paradigm shift that could be a common view that would tend toward more than liberalization in China and more making capitalism sustainable in the United States.
Okay, so the first comment is very interesting. I often joke that if you merge China and the United States, and there are a lot of issues where you kind of get close to an ideal. I think we don't save nearly enough; they save way too much. I think we have poor institutions for compensating losers and helping workers in communities that are hurt by globalization, and that's undermined political support. I agree. I'm not sure China's a great model of that, but they do have very extensive, transfers from winners to losers. They probably overdo it, creating a moral hazard problem, and I think we tend to underdo it.
Well, one could avoid that by having a paradigm of human capital investment.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of good research emerging on some of the areas of the United States that are in decline. And one thing that's happened is geographic mobility has declined very dramatically in the U.S. So it used to be this kind of, what do you call it, globalization or whatever, this has been going on for forever. So textile industry moved out of New England in the 1950s, and the first place it went was to the Carolinas, and you had all these empty mill towns, Lawrence, Massachusetts, places like that. A lot of them have pretty successfully reinvented themselves, but it took a long, painful time, and then geographic mobility was important. Those populations have declined in many of those cities. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, which has had the largest population decline of any major city in the United States over the last 50 plus years. And so geographic mobility is important, and plausibly that ties to human capital and to what the financial system is doing.
You've probably lived in China long enough to understand the sophistication of that society. And in your talk, you mentioned the transition from investment-driven society or business model, economic model, to a consumer-driven economic model. However, with a high Gini index economy model, what are your thoughts, or from your perspective, what do you think are the potential solutions for such transition to happen?
So I think in many ways, the things China has to do are easier than the things the United States has to do, to be frank. I remember one funny discussion between Tim Geithner and Wang Qishan where Geithner was saying, the United States, we need to tighten our belts and save more and reduce the fiscal deficit. And we're asking you to go out to dinner and send your kids to college and travel to Paris. We're asking you to consume more. That's got to be, it's got to be politically a winning strategy for a government to set out to encourage its people to consume more. So that's a slightly flip answer, because I think there are a lot of different policies behind that. But to sort of think of some of the serious policies, some of the real challenges China has. I mentioned the labor force has peaked, but there's still a large rural population. Many of them will want to move to the cities, but if they don't get a good education, then it's going to be very hard for them to move and be productive. So I think the education disparities in China between the countryside and the city, something like 80+% of city kids go to college now in China, and the figure in rural areas, I forget, but it's really strikingly different, So I think when I think of some of the inequalities in China, strikes me Chinese people don't mind the income inequality, in the sense that if they see Jack Ma successful earning money, they don't really care about that. They don't like the corruption, that's my perception, so the anti-corruption campaign is popular. And this kind of inequality in, say, education, or even when migrant children move to the city, the inability to get education and social services, I think those kind of inequalities are going to, hold back China's efficiency and China's growth and the, the happiness of its own people. This gentleman.
Although it is lots of Chinese and Americans hope that United States would play small ball, long ball, whatever with China, but according to the conventional power dependence analysis, there is still an imbalance of trade vulnerability between the two countries. For example, in China, only about 1/5 of the exports go to the United States, equating to almost 4% of Chinese GDP. However, for the U.S., only 1/10 of its exports go to China, accounting less than 1% of U.S. GDP. So there is an imbalance out there. So my question is, to what extent this imbalance lead to imbalance would mean a credible threat to China from the U.S. in terms of dealing with, for example, North Korea?
Okay, so the questions are getting harder and harder. So I take that to mean, so I think it's going to be really hard to solve the North Korea problem, to be frank. And it seemed the two presidents had different strategies, when they met in Florida. The U.S. thinks that China should put the squeeze on North Korea economically, and that'll get Mr. Kim to change his behavior. And the Chinese think that won't get Mr. Kim to change his behavior, and that the U.S. should sit down and negotiate directly with him to, assuage his worries about regime change. So I don't want to go, I don't want to go too far into those details. But to me, you're kind of asking the question: is there any chance that if we really can't make progress on that the United States, for example, might impose a large tariff on China? I think that's very unlikely. It's certainly been the tradition in our relationship not to retaliate for things in different arenas. So if we have some kind of, we've had a couple of ugly incidents. A U.S. plane collided with a Chinese plane around Hainan Island. Usually what happens then is that you freeze military relations for a while. Or we're unhappy with some economic result, we stop tire imports. The tradition has been to respond to unhappiness within the same arena. That doesn't mean that it can't change, but that would be a very big change if the United States tried to use economic leverage to get China to change, to do something in North Korea. So personally, I think it's kind of unlikely. But I guess if I were the Chinese leaders, I would worry about it a little bit. But if I were the Chinese leaders, I wouldn't worry too much about harsh protectionist measures from the U.S. because, as I said, they will hurt the U.S. economy. So I don't think it's likely that the U.S. is going to do that.
Sort of related to the question before last, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the individual households, like the optimal savings problem. One thing, is there anything like sort of impeding the efficiency of investing in, say, like stocks rather than real estate? Or, also maybe predictions for the future? Like, do you see young people having the same sort of savings preferences as like the current old?
Right. So the easy answer to your question is household saving as a share of GDP in China is not all that high, and it's not the problem. Household saving is about 20% of GDP, and overall saving is close to 50% of GDP. So I'm used to saying, households don't seem to be the main problem. You've got a lot of corporate saving, and some of that corporate saving is good, but I think state enterprises in China earn rents. They don't pay dividends to anyone. They don't have very good incentives. Plus, the government of China has a very high savings rate, which is a little bit mystifying. But I think partly it's that the government is collecting a lot of payroll taxes, which they are purportedly investing for the future to pay for pensions. And so this does then come back to households. I think household behavior suggests that they don't really believe they're going to get a government pension in the end. So you've got the high government saving, and then you have the households behaving as if they don't really have confidence they're going to get anything from the government. And so that combination may be a problem. And then I don't want to overstate the case. we've been trying to get U.S. credit card companies into the Chinese market. You can't really use credit cards in China in any serious way, and there's probably no simple solution to that. But that kind of, the U.S. has that kind of frustration that our credit card companies can't get into China and offer people credit. There are all kinds of restrictions on the kind of assets people can buy. They manage the stock market so state enterprises can list there, but who wants to buy a minority stake in a state enterprise? You don't really know what you're buying, and they've limited the ability of Chinese private companies to list. So there are a lot of, I think there are a lot of distortions in the financial market. But if if the Chinese asked me seriously, what can we do to reduce the national savings rate? I would start with the public sector measures before I would think about incentives for households.
So on the topic of Chinese capital outflow, you kind of divided the destination between developing country and developed country, and you mentioned that in developing countries that China's helping them with infrastructure and gaining soft power. So I was wondering what kind of effect that China's getting at investing in developed countries. Are they merely just getting investment returns, or are they also getting soft powers or other effects?
Right. So I think in the United States, a lot of local governments, welcome the Chinese investment. So I think they are generating goodwill at the level of local government and even perhaps with some labor unions in the United States. That may be more in the future. At the federal level, our federal institutions see a lot of this as a problem. They worry about security issues. They worry about, so right now the Westinghouse nuclear power business is going bankrupt. That's already owned by Japan, right? It's owned by a foreign company, Toshiba. But our administration is worried about China taking over that firm. So I think at the federal level, there are a lot of different concerns. But at the state and local level, it's generating some goodwill.
Thank you. Another question on foreign investment. With respect to One Belt, One Road, can you give some color in terms of how much funding has been committed versus actual projects that have been completed and delivered? And then to kind of tie in the other question, and has there been any demonstrated soft power advantage that's been accrued to date with that initiative?
Right. So One Belt, One Road, I would say, it's not a clearly defined program. So it's hard to answer your question, but I've started doing some research on this, so I can partially answer it. So while it's not a well-defined program, there is an official list of countries involved. I'm not sure all the countries have agreed to it, but my research assistant found an official list of the countries involved. So I did a quick analysis. And in terms of direct investment, what you can expect is getting 50% less foreign investment by being a country in the One Belt, One Road program. So don't take that too seriously, but it's early days, and there's hard to find any evidence that you're going to get more direct investment, and that partly because the big locations for the direct investment I already mentioned: United States, United Kingdom, Europe, Australia. But then it's about much more than just direct investment. Probably the main flows are from the big policy banks, China Exim Bank, China Development Bank, and eventually AIB, though that's starting out rather slowly. And so I haven't done the formal analysis, but I know that some of the big borrowers from those Chinese policy banks are Angola, Brazil, and Venezuela. And I would argue that none of them are involved in One Belt, One Road, unless you want to define One Belt, One Road as the whole world. So I'm skeptical that it has much substance yet. President Xi went to Pakistan, promised them a $50 billion package, but that's all vague commitment. As I said, when you actually look at who's gotten money from the policy banks, the answers are Venezuela, Brazil, Angola, Ethiopia, and Africa. So I'll be looking into it more, but I'm skeptical that as of now, there's much substance. Evan might want to disagree. We can have some disagreement.
There have been connectivity initiatives in Asia for close to 2 decades. And until China announced the Belt and Road, very few people paid attention to a lot of those initiatives. That applies even to the big Chinese connectivity initiatives. When I think especially about continental Eurasia, the most significant Chinese-backed and financed infrastructure projects to date involved a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan and an oil pipeline from Kazakhstan, both of which are significant because they diversified the markets to which those producers sold, but both of which also predated the Belt and Road. So those are not Belt and Road pipes, they're Chinese pipes. So to go back to an earlier point David made, if you think about this more organically, as China over a period of time becoming a factor around its continental and maritime periphery, and then becoming an exporter of capital globally, a lot of that is happening for structural and other reasons that have nothing to do with the Belt and Road. And then, even within Asia, some of the most important infrastructure-related projects in important economies like India, where it really is Japanese, not Chinese capital that's been implicated, show you that this is more of an Asian story and not just a Belt and Road story. The missing piece in all of it, though, is the United States, because we don't do that kind of finance. And more importantly, in a lot of the so-called Belt and Road countries, the United States is not a big factor. So in Central Asia, for example, the US is barely visible economically. In most of South Asia, minus India, the United States is barely visible economically. In mainland Southeast Asia, minus Vietnam, the United States is barely visible economically. In Thailand, the US is becoming invisible politically. So when you add that up, China has the ability to translate even a small amount of capital than the pledge into something that's politically and strategically significant, because you can do a lot in Pakistan even if 1/10 of that pledge materializes.
What are your thoughts on the growing push for automation and the use of industrial robots, especially in like the southern provinces like Guangdong and around the Pearl River Delta?
Right. So, as China's labor force shrinks, and it'll start out with a very slow shrinkage of the labor force, and there's still a lot of people in the countryside, I think, who could move to cities and be more productive. But then eventually, China's going to have a very sharp decline in its labor force unless it opens up to enormous mass immigration, which doesn't seem likely. So I think automation has to be a key part of China's future. And kind of timing it is going to be tricky in the sense that, right now there's still need to create jobs for people moving from the countryside. But within a few decades, that'll change. My sense is China's investing very heavily in robotics. Some of the stuff they're interested in acquiring in the United States and Europe definitely has to do with robotics and automation. So I think that makes sense.
Thank you for your time. You said that China has specific instruments at its disposal to avoid a conventional financial crisis. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on that, and what are the differences between China today and, say, Japan in the late 1980s?
So some of the kind of specific instruments I'm thinking about, I mentioned they have this fund, take profits from successful enterprises. And then also, frankly, the heads of all the big banks are senior Communist Party officials. There really is a red phone on their desk, and if it seems like they've allowed 9 bond defaults this year, which is already like kind of a big increase from the past, but it's tiny for that economy. If there are too many bond defaults developing, they really can pick up the red phone, and say, we just can't see too many more of these. You've got to get in and find which of these companies you can lend to and, bail them out, basically. I'm getting tired, so I had one more thought on this. So I've been part of some interesting discussions between the Fed at a very, very senior level and their Chinese counterparts, which are mostly extremely friendly conversations. And in real estate, so part of the problem, one of the things Chinese have to worry about is the real estate market keeps blowing hot and cold, and it's kind of hard to pin down. The data aren't very good. Well, they can announce purchase restrictions for certain cities, and they can announce mortgage parameters that differ by city, and I remember listening to our Fed saying, wow, this would just, be unconstitutional in the United States to say, okay, we're going to have different regulations for Phoenix compared to Las Vegas. It just, you just couldn't do it in the United States. Now, I'm a huge fan of our system, but I'm just objectively, China has a lot of instruments that may end up, kind of preserving things and keeping things going in a way that ultimately is not helpful. So the last point you asked about Japan, the main difference between China now and Japan, say in 1990, is China's at a much lower stage of development. So when I talk about, China could be maybe they should just be satisfied with growing at 4.5 or 5, right? At their stage of development, that's just kind of an average performance, I mean, that would be almost like a Japan-style deterioration given where they are, because Japan was already at something like 90% of U.S. per capita GDP when they had their financial crisis, so they went to 0, right? So there are people who predict China's growth will grind down to 0. It might happen for a year, but I don't see that. If you're looking out over 10 years, to me, a weak scenario is they grow at 4 or 5%. That's a weak scenario looking out over 10 years, given that they're still at 25% of U.S. per capita GDP. And then again, I could be wrong. I always like to remind people, like, we can analyze things and attach some probabilities, but I like to end by saying I think we should be humble. There's a lot of uncertainties, and so it's possible there'll be a financial crisis in China in the next couple of years, and I'll be surprised, and I'll be the first one to write on a blog, hey, I was wrong about this, So.
Hey, David, thanks for coming.
All right, great.